Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of Townsend Talks, a series of webinars on the future of education. Now, the purpose of these talks is to engage the school and broader community in reflecting on how education will evolve in the coming decades and the distinctive role that Townsend education can play in empowering youth to be leaders of tomorrow. Now, at the conclusion of the speaker series, we are arranging several vision dialogues where you can provide input into how the ideas you have heard should shape Townsend's plans for the future. We also invite you to support the school's campaign, Townshend-30, which aims to raise 4.8 million euros in donations or loans by the end of May to enable the school to purchase the campus it has rented for over 2 decades. Please visit Townshend30.com for more information and on how to make a gift or a loan. I'm Mark Chase, a parent at Townsend International School, and I'll be your host and moderator for these discussions. These sessions will be recorded. We would also like to invite all participants joining today to remain on mute, but you're more than welcome to turn on your cameras. Now, these webinars will be interactive, and you will also be able to take part in the discussion. We will be taking your questions and invite you to put them into the chat box. Your questions will be answered by our experts who are joining us in a special segment later this hour. Now, today's keynote speaker is Daniel Perell. Daniel joined the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office as a representative in 2011. His areas of work include social and sustainable development, climate change and the environment, global citizenship, human rights, and the role of religion in society. Daniel received a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law and an MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and was admitted to the New York State Bar Association. We also have a panel of experts who will be asking Daniel questions after his talk. Let me introduce Farid Bidardel, who holds a master's degree in education, specializing in youth and adult education, and is a lecturer at the University of Marburg on entrepreneurship. Farid was previously working for the Social Impact and was responsible for managing and organizing startup incubators. Also joining us is Vahid Kamzi. For 10 years, Vahid helped companies use software to transform their businesses in Asia, based out of Singapore. First as a developer, then as a management consultant with BCG, and then with SAP in leading the sales strategy. Now he is based in Germany at SAP headquarters, where he is helping build, launch, and scale new industry vertical software. Finally, we have Soraya Bagheri, who has been working with the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office since 2020. She is passionate about the youth empowerment, gender equality, and global citizenship. Soraya is the co-founder of a technology company based out of Washington, D.C., and has experience with global law firms and international organizations across 4 continents. Soraya received her law degrees from Sorbonne University and UCLA School of Law and is admitted to the New York State Bar. Prior to her legal career, Soraya was trained as an educator focused on social and economic development programs. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'd like to now welcome Daniel to present his topic. Daniel, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for what I think was the most professional introduction I've ever received. I'm blown away and very thrilled to be here with you all. I do have a presentation that I'll share, but I'll stay on screen just for a little bit so you can know whose voice you're hearing if you like that sort of thing. But in a moment, I will no longer be on screen, I think, and hope for your sake. But let me just share the screen. I wanted to mention I am at home with my wife and 2 daughters, so apologies in advance if and when things go funny with their presence, but hopefully that won't happen. So yes, I've been asked to speak a little bit on the role of digital technology in a just transition. This is likely a result of my engagement in what's known as the Commission for Social Development at the United Nations, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it's an area in which the Office of the Baha'i International Community is learning, and I am looking forward to hearing from you all with your thoughts and reflections either on this talk or on other related items as we go forward. So first, let's just get a little bit of context for what is the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office outside of a mouthful. What we do is we try to represent the Baha'i community, that is a religious faith that has some relationship, of course, with Townsend. And we try to share what is being learned by the Baha'i communities and their colleagues all over the world as they're engaging in development projects and gender equality and youth empowerment and the role of religion in society, and we try to share those learnings with the international community as it's engaging in conversations around these issues in New York and around the world. And we do this through statements, through the relationships that we build, by sharing the Baha'i experience that we have, by working alongside others. I think I may need to close this so you all can see it. Working alongside others. And we focus on the discourses of humanity, whatever is sort of top of mind at the moment, but also those long arcs that may be less urgent and more important. We try to engage on those issues. And then, of course, from time to time, we have to work in defense of the Baha'i community as they face persecution from time to time in various countries around the world. So then what is the United Nations? Many people have different understandings of what the UN is and how it works. It really is a club of 193 governments. They come together in a number of different realms, in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, at the International Criminal Court, and they try to advance the issues related to humanity's challenges of the moment. And these three charter bodies I mentioned, the General Assembly, Security Council, and the International Criminal Court, are joined by a couple of others, one of which is known as the Economic and Social Council. And it is in that space that non-governmental organizations have the capacity to engage through what's known as accreditation. So the Economic and Social Council has a number of different commissions, subcommissions. So you have this big council, and then there's a lot of commissions that focus on different areas of expertise, like the status of women, population and development, indigenous issues, and then social development, which is the commission with which we were engaged this year on this issue of digital technology. And each commission chooses a theme to focus on every year. And it can get a little bit challenging because the themes change year on year. And so you revisit some themes from time to time, and at other times it's brand new themes. And it seems that as the world is getting more complex, they've made it their goal, member states have made it their goal to make the themes as complicated as possible, which is great fun for everybody who's trying to explain their work. So the theme for this year, for a commission that took place in February, was called Socially Just Transition Towards Sustainable Development, the Role of Digital Technologies on Social Development and Well-Being of All. Now, if you were working at the UN, you would see that they checked every box for the key message to be mentioned, with the exception of maybe gender equality. And of course, there was nothing about the coronavirus because this theme was selected a year prior to the coronavirus really taking off. So it was quite a prescient theme to focus on digital technology as it gained a more central role in our lives, but it was unrelated to the coronavirus. So that's briefly what the BIC is, that's briefly what the UN is. Now let's get into a little bit of substance. And before we jump into digital technology, I want to speak a little bit about the depth of change that we're trying to refer to here. And so there are many folks who offer different theories, and these sort of build on each other for how the world can become a better place. And all of these things contribute to change, and there are various degrees to which we engage them. So I've used the layers of the onion as kind of my mental framing for this. And it starts with the behavior. Our own individual behavior, the behavior of leaders, the behavior in our homes and in our communities, in our corporations, in our classrooms. Changing behavior is really a vital part of the change that we need to see in the world. But changing behavior is limited in its effects because it's very local, it's very bilateral. So in the aggregate, it has a marked impact, but for the rapid changes we need, perhaps we need something a little bit stronger. So a lot of people say, let's change the people. Our leaders aren't sufficient. They're not doing this, that, or the other. Let's get new CEOs. Let's get new leaders. Let's get, if we're an athletic game, let's get a new set of athletes and they'll do the right thing. But the people are produced actually by the structure. So you have a structure in place, and it's sort of an educational structure. It's a corporate structure. And in order to succeed in those structures, the people that rise to the top have certain behaviors, and you see these things build on each other: the structure, the people, the behavior. So we need to go a little bit deeper even than the structures to our conceptual framework. Here, there's a big cliff, a big gap rather. The change in the structure is one can easily imagine. The change in the conceptual framework is a little bit harder. So what do I mean by this? I am thinking about things like, how do we understand success? How do we understand progress? Right now, most of our world is geared through a materialistic frame. So success is an increase in your income, or it's a raise, or it's a new title. It's a very sort of superficial understanding of success, which I think is a little bit contrary to, I think, the goals of a school like Townsend and the religions of the world as well. But until that conceptual framework of more social and spiritual advancement takes hold, we have to really think about the market forces, the materialism that often seems to take precedence as we are building the structures and encouraging the people and the behavior that results. And for this, we need to think about our first principles. So if our first principle isn't about a material gain, what is it about? And here, I think we need to be really considering the change in human history. Where we are now, we recognize the interrelatedness, the interconnectedness, the solidarity required. This was not always true, of course, when nations weren't connected by a World Wide Web that we are benefiting from at this very moment, when we were organized in nations or smaller in city-states or in communities. Our needs did not really have that global impact, and our desires did not have that global impact. And so the systems and structures that were set up didn't feed into it. Whereas now, anything I look at on my desk, in my office, in my bedroom, they all have an international component. Maybe they were made in China. Maybe they were shipped on a boat that's from Panama. Maybe they were, a food that I really love that comes from Mexico. I mean, all of these things are interrelated. We are engaged in this global web even before the internet. And so we have to think about the first principles with which we have to live now that are different to what existed before. Now we are international, and we need to change all of these dimensions before we can really respond adequately to it. So that's kind of the framework. And what we try to speak to at the BIC is a lot more about the conceptual framework and the first principles, knowing that once you have those in place, we can build structures, encourage certain kinds of people and behaviors that can result. It's like the base of a building. So I want to talk one more time about the depth of the crisis. So if we look at three levels, the genotype is the underlying bit, the phenotype is kind of the outward expression of the genes, and the symptoms is kind of the transitory expressions of various moments. We can see that right now some of the symptoms are digital technology, misinformation, the health crisis, racism, our abusive relationship with nature, extractive relationship with nature, economic inequality, political expediency, and there are many more. These are some of the symptoms. And these are undergirded by some kind of what I would call a phenotype of belonging and materialism and identity and constituency and short-termism. And you see how economic inequality is expressed as a result of its connection to needs for materialism and belonging and identity. And the same goes for digital technology. It's built on a materialistic frame. It offers this sense of belonging through communities that have popped up in that space. And our identity comes through quite a bit there as well. But that's just the phenotype, and it's an expression of our underlying narrative of who we are. It's an identity-based, distinction-based kind of narrative that has some real impacts on the ultimate expression of these both phenotypes and symptoms. So now let's go in. Now that we have that broad framework, let's go in a little bit to the statement. And the statement that we produced, that the Baha'i International Community produced for this commission, to which I referred earlier, is called Reflections of Our Values, Digital Technologies and a Just Transition. And essentially, we chose this title because digital tech doesn't exist as just a thing out there. It is a reflection of our values. What it is that we find most important and most meaningful is woven into the fabric of our digital technology. So then we need to be really questioning those underlying values, that center of the onion, if we really want to get that ultimate kind of digital technology that results in a world of greater compassion, solidarity, trust, and really progress, flourishing even. But we are fighting a certain kind of narrative that the Baha'i International Community was concerned with. It's that innovation is this great savior. How do we fix climate change? We just innovate our way out of it. The market will save us. The science will save us. Add to that digital technology is 90% good. I mean, it's got a couple of problems on the side, but it is mostly good. Then what you get to this equation is that we just need to adopt technology and then let's just do that. So we export the various kind of assumptions that underlie technology to different corners of the world, and we just assume that this is what's going to result. And of course, as I mentioned, there are some fringe problems. You've got the misinformation, you've got some of those bots that come up here and there, but those are really the side hustle. The real meat is that digital tech is fantastic. But this is something that we wanted to question. And so we were talking about a blind adoption of technology. And it's in many ways a reflection of these deeper assumptions about development that I touched on briefly earlier. So what are the main themes of the statement? So we have a video, which gives me a chance to have a little bit of water and you to have a chance to stop listening to me. And I'll share this briefly. It was a quick introduction to the statement, meant to inspire some thought, and just let me know if it's not working. And I hope you enjoy it. Great. So hopefully that was somewhat helpful. Please just let me know if there are problems with the sharing of all of these things. So if technology is to be a means of enhanced flourishing, it must extend capabilities in a manner that reflects the essential human ideals and aspirations. Aha, I fixed that problem. Great. So this is essentially what we're trying to say, is that the success of technology must be an expression of the essential human ideals and aspirations that we're seeking. And now forgive that the balance of this talk is now going to be a lot of words on the screen, and I'm not going to say all of them. They're just there in case you would like this presentation afterwards. I'll give it to the organizers. It can be shared however they share things. So I just pulled out a couple of quotes, but I'll talk through them rather than reading them. So again, as mentioned, we have to be concerned when digital technology and the assumptions underlying it are really influenced by these materialistic underpinnings. And we have to question those and assess those at all times. It's again, not to denigrate where we've gotten. There has been tremendous progress. We just have to think about it as we are continuing to advance. Another theme we raised was, again, asking questions about underlying assumptions, and how technology can support and enhance these local values. We have to include users of technology in these conversations. Often it's just the creators who sit in a room and decide what's best for others. But often, these technologies are exported from one part of the world to another, and those in that other part of the world maybe don't share the same assumptions or values. So users of technology should no longer be at the very end, but actually incorporated at the beginning. And then in this sense, the role of the United Nations is quite clear. I mean, it is a space, a supposedly neutral space, where many nations and actors can come together and discuss many of these issues to determine globally what is appropriate and necessary. So in short, in sum, humanity is being propelled to greater degrees of integration, but it requires both digital technology and other technologies, as well as a process of genuine consultation. And then this can lead to the opportunity for all to contribute. And when all are able to do so, it leads to flourishing. And then this, of course, will then lead to a future reflecting the highest expression of humanity's aspirations. So we're also here to talk about education, of course, and what is the role of education in all of this? And so let's remember that onion. And if we look closely at that onion from before, you see education is right in the middle. And that means that we need to really be thinking about how we educate the youngest generations and how we re-educate ourselves as we are learning and growing in this world. I think I'm part of that generation that remembers days before the internet. But soon enough, before we know it, everybody will have grown up in an internet-connected world. And that's going to be a different kind of space. And education models are, of course, based on generations like mine or even before mine who've created what we have now. And so it's kind of this strange moment where we're being educated by those pre-internet folks or pre-internet curricula in a post-internet world. So what I did is I looked at some of the BIC statements actually for what we've said about education. And so it's one of those essential solutions that will enable the establishment of patterns of relationship. It's actually deeper than just reading, writing, and arithmetic, especially when you have Google in your hands. It's deeper than knowing the facts. Anybody can just search now for most of the facts in the world. It's actually about understanding relationships. We have to unleash those intellectual and spiritual powers. We have to encourage a genuine love for all humanity and inculcate an orientation towards service. And then this will, of course, articulate a vision of the future that can be motivating, not disheartening, but actually the role of hope in education can't be overstated. It's really important that our youth, our children, and even ourselves, I don't want to confine education to the classroom, between the ages of 5 and 18. All of us need to educate ourselves with this tinge of hope so that we are always galvanized towards building a better world. This also has to be coupled with an attitude of humility, something that I think is not valued enough in our educational systems. And we have to recognize that the first step of education is admitting that you don't know everything. And that humility is actually often denigrated at the international stage and in politics and in the media. So we have to inculcate that spirit of humility and then create consultative spaces. It is through this consultation process that we can really learn from each other. And as we develop those skills of listening and of modifying our understandings, we will then create new solutions that are locally and community-wide applicable and not just adopting what comes from outside. So I will read this last one because I thought it was lovely. The human spirit, which can be regarded in one sense as the collection of endowments that distinguish human beings from other species, including the human mind, has the capacity to know, to love, and to will. It is a force that has for too long been undervalued, and as such, humanity has been deprived of a limitless source of prosperity. Releasing its powers requires an education that would help children develop the skills and knowledge needed to both transform their characters and lead to productive lives. And I think, and I hope this is what is happening at Townsend, and this is what brings us together today, is to think critically about the role of education in bringing this spirit also to the digital technology field. So now with that, I'll open it up for questions, or I'll hand back to Mark, who will take us through the rest of the afternoon, I believe. Thanks so much.
Daniel, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation that you provided to us. Now, our next 20 minutes will be a roundtable discussion. So let me now welcome Farid Bidardel, Vahid Khamzi, and Soraya Bagheri. Now, a reminder that you're also part of the discussion. We welcome your comments or questions. And if you have already submitted a question to the chat box, we do appreciate that. Remember, in our last 20 minutes of this webinar, our panel will be answering your questions. So let me kick things off by asking the first question to you, Daniel. Now, one thing that was really standing out for me in your particular discussion was specifically about economic inequality. And we can't help but discuss the so-called haves versus have-nots, that in many schools, the privilege of having digital technology is there, and being able to align that with the moral and spiritual values of that particular school. But my question to you is, looking at the situation with a lot of schools and a lot of children out there who do not have access to sufficient digital technology, don't have the resources for that, how do we bridge that digital divide?
That's a very good question. I think the first way that I would answer that is just to think about the purpose of education. And if, as that last quote articulates, if it is to create this spirit of collaboration, to allow what distinguishes us as human beings to really flourish, then actually digital technology is less important. And I wouldn't force the digital technology on every corner of the world because, you know, Americans have it, so everybody else needs to have it in order to keep up with Americans. Well, you know, that's gotten us somewhere. I don't want it to, again, diminish the progress that has been made, nor do I want to say that those communities should be left to a world that is not connected. But I think that the first question I would ask is, how can we create an educational experience with what we have? Because that's the most urgent thing. That's the first thing. The next one is essentially how do we work through various government structures, institutional structures, and private structures to encourage the wiring, the connecting of all of these communities. I mean, it's going to take all of us to find ways to connect those communities that are so-called off the grid because they have much to contribute. But it has to be done with a proper understanding of their values, their perspectives, rather than just feeding them into a polluted stream, so to speak. It's helping that stream of theirs, which may have its also share of pollution, helping that stream to feed into the story of humanity, not artificially, but genuinely. And so it is a challenge, but I mean, many do put that as kind of a first challenge, but my first question is, what does this community need for educating its children, its youth? Let's get that first, and then we can worry about plugging them into a system that brings all kinds of forces that may not all be what we want, or more importantly, what they want for their children.
Very interesting, Daniel. Let's perhaps loop in Vahid Khamzi, who is very deeply involved in the role of technology and software. What are your thoughts specifically with regards to the response that Daniel has provided us? And generally, what was your main takeaway from his discussion?
Thanks. I never thought of these topics in this way, Daniel. I'm working in the tech space. And of course, you're right. I think we have to really rethink the fundamentals of what we're doing, why we're doing it. What's interesting to me is that I can see that generally the people in this industry are actually at the forefront of this. I mean, open source is a key part of technology. We use it. I mean, the CERN and a large number of public institutions invented the core technologies that provide HTTP when we type HTTP, or when you use, I don't know if you use BitTorrent for sharing allowed software, obviously, Firefox, Mozilla Foundation. So I think a lot of people actually, the motto in lots of the startup world is give first. So we give first, then you receive. So I love this industry. Of course, there's all of the aspects of the greed, the momentum in the startup, so much money is thrown. But I would say fundamentally, people are really good, want to do good. And 3 years ago, I was in Siena, Italy, with some very smart guy, Marcello Damiani. His view was extremely modern. He said, in the life science industries, we're way back. We need to advance. We need to go faster. We need to go cloud. So this man is a very interesting guy. And he tried to explain to me a very complex concept of mRNA. And he was the CIO of Moderna. Incredible how these technologies, if it hadn't existed 3 years ago, they hadn't started with mRNA. Look at today, the ability of all of these pharma companies powered by technology to do the advances that we're having. So it's quite incredible for me that, of course, there is greed, there is aspects and motivations, but the ability of technology to progress us and to impact us in our day-to-day has been huge. Of course, I think we need to rethink now, and that's what you're inviting us, look at the basics and the fundamentals of this. But I think generally, as you say, 90%, 95, I would say even 99%. And the 1% for me would be social media. And I would love to have your views also on that part of technology. But I would say 99% in the way it powers our lives has been really positive, and especially when I look at what Soraya and Farid are doing.
Well, perhaps let's loop in Soraya. And Soraya, you have your own tech company. You focus a lot about youth empowerment and gender equality and global citizenship. How do we then take on this theme about digital transformation, really making sure that we have an inclusive world, that everyone is getting the best opportunity to have their own best opportunity?
Yeah, no, thank you for this opportunity to share, and thanks Fahid and Dan for sharing your experiences. So the tech company that my husband and I founded, I mean, we're very interested in gender equality and in education. And my background is I had a brief time as an educator before I went into law, and then was a lawyer, and then founded the tech company. So the focus of our tech company is really to use technology as one of the fastest and cheapest ways to ensure that everyone has the ability to stay informed. And this kind of came as a result of us trying to investigate truth about what our government is doing, who do we vote for in the United States. And so it kind of started as an offshoot of us just trying to find truth. And so we ended up building two products, so a mobile application which helps users and citizens stay informed, and also a public affairs software and legislative tool where organizations, advocacy groups, nonprofits can ensure that they have the information they need to influence policy. And I think that one thing that we've really learned is that, kind of touching on the statement that Dan also mentioned in his presentation about the users of technology and how they have to be incorporated from that very beginning when we're developing products. And I think interviewing who our potential kind of users would be, not just the app itself, but also the software, and ensuring that our team was incredibly diverse as well in terms of background and gender. I think really played an impact in the way that we were building our technology and the way that we were thinking about it as well, because it's, you know, nonpartisan, unbiased way of accessing information. And I think that in DC wasn't something that was maybe trending or something that you would hear very often in various spaces. So I really think the concept of having more diversity within tech companies is very, very important.
That's an interesting point there, Daniel. Let's reach out to you and invite you to come back off on mute there. What are your thoughts around what Soraya is referencing?
So I'm going to be guilty as charged because I was trying to answer some of the chat box questions as she was contributing. Could you hone in on the question more precisely, and I will stop trying to answer the chat box questions?
Yeah, and don't worry about the chat box question, Daniel. We have an entire segment in our last third where we'll deal with every single one. So thank you, everybody who has been putting every one of their questions into chat. Soraya, yes, if you could perhaps rephrase your question for Daniel.
Sure, yeah. So Dan, I was just touching a little bit on that part in the statement that you also mentioned in your presentation about how the users of technology should be incorporated from the very beginning in the development of different technologies, and how there should be more diversity within the tech sector or anywhere that technology is being made.
Great. So actually, I love that question because the report I was looking up and I just put in the chat box is precisely on that question. The World Bank took some time to study some behavioral economics, which is not a loved field at the World Bank because it's actually difficult to quantify some of these things. And it actually changes the way that we would understand how a policy would find expression in a local community. And so what they were finding is that, you know, they would just introduce the policy that's most logical to whoever was creating that program or what have you. And then the knock-on effects were not always what people had predicted. And so, you know, it'd be about how to create better access to water for some of the community members, particularly female community members in Africa. You know, there's this famous example of walking to the river, and then you put in access to a well, or you have people deliver water, or you give them filters. There's all kinds of different interventions that could be selected. And it turns out that at least for this one community, the example that they were giving, a bench was really what they wanted. Because the women appreciated going off and having that time on their own. The issue is really that they were getting exhausted and they just wanted a bench, a place where they could sit along the way. And so the intervention didn't need to be that huge thing because their values were less about making the water easier. It was more about ensuring that they could have that community life and that time for the women to discuss on their own. But that's not something that the creators of a policy would have thought at the beginning. So again, if you bring in the users from the beginning, there may be some alternative solutions or more appropriate solutions to that community that you wouldn't have originally thought about. And interestingly, they also did some of these studies, behavioral economic studies, on the World Bank staff themselves. And the World Bank staff had the greatest difficulty detaching themselves from orthodoxy, World Bank orthodoxy, about how to eradicate poverty and all of these things. And it was, and for that reason, the report wasn't very well received, which I thought was fascinating. It sort of pinned a little bit the World Bank staff themselves on their own blindness to the needs of local communities. So I don't have the answer for what one would come up with. But I think the more that end users can be involved in the articulation, particularly in the lower income world, in the articulation of good technology, even social media policies, these things would redound in some way, both to the policy and the product themselves, but also to that community having greater facility and greater ownership of it. So I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I do think it would have some really interesting benefits.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity to loop in Farid into this discussion. Farid is a lecturer of entrepreneurship, and we think of looping users in, identifying those opportunities. This is a discussion which I'm sure happens in your classroom almost on a daily basis. What do your students often think about when it comes to a needs analysis, entrepreneurship? What does the user need? Perhaps you could tell us more, Farid.
That's a very good question. It's definitely something that the students always wonder before they actually start a business, because let me rephrase that. This is the question that the students should ask themselves before they start a venture, and often they forget. They often build a business or build a path, and forget to wonder, what does the user actually want? And then they learn that sometimes a little bit too late, and then they have to backtrack. But at the end of the day, I think especially when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to building a new venture, building a new a path, it's very important to start with a problem in the beginning, to understand the problem first, to go at it. And that's if you want to bring this back to education in general, it's the same thing. If you want to understand anything, a subject, if it doesn't matter what subject it is, you first have to go and really understand the problem that you want to solve. And then once you understand it, then it's so much easier to solve it. And often we do it the other way around. We have a solution to something, but we actually haven't understood the problem first. And that's something that I try to make sure that the students learn very, very, very quickly.
You know, I can see it's resonating with Soraya there. Soraya, what are your thoughts around what Farid is saying?
Yeah, I think actually that's such a great point, Farid. And I think kind of not coming from an entrepreneurship, an entrepreneurial background, being a lawyer, the way that I think was always very different from how entrepreneurs think. And I think that was maybe unexperienced entrepreneurs. So it was really to my advantage that I really wanted to find the problem, to be able to find a solution. And I think that it's very, very important. I think that also when we identify a problem within technology, it's not just what I think as Soraya, but am I consulting with others within a community, those that will be impacted by the solution that we're trying to create is very important. And I think that's the shift that's needed within the tech world and within the startup environment. Kind of how often are we really interviewing or speaking with those that will be impacted by the technology to see if the solution we're providing is really something that would benefit that particular community.
That's a very good point there, Daniel. How often are communities discussed when we talk about having a just transition with regards to digital transformation?
Yeah, so I am of two minds, because I think Vahid's point was really valuable, that we have to separate the media advance, the social media, the social side of this digital technology revolution from the more, I don't know how to describe the non-social media side, but like the pure advancement, the pure scientific and technological advancement in terms of productivity and all of these other qualities. And I think that the community, again, I can't provide like a number 7 times out of X, but I think that the more we can bring those communities in, the better off we will be. And actually that's something that the UN is struggling to learn about, because sometimes when communities are brought into the UN space, it really challenges the orthodoxy of the government, of the member states. because communities will come in and say, the picture you're painting is lovely, but it's not accurate. And here's what the actual picture looks like. And that can be quite a challenge to those who are in power. And so we see in too many parts of the world that there is in fact less civil society, less community engagement, because it would buck the trend of what has allowed those in power to get into power and to stay in power. And as that kind of zero-sum game advances, I think we are seeing, and we will continue to see, some of these challenges. However, if we can short circuit that by just adopting a posture of humility and of learning in advance, and just saying, you know what, we're trying to paint a rosy picture. You're right, it's not always perfect, but we want to work with you to make it better. Those countries, those governments, and engagements with the private sector and the public sector, we see real advancements, because they are, as Farid was referencing, they are actually communicating with the end users and the communities to understand the needs and the opportunities. But unfortunately, the underlying assumptions behind power and leadership are such that that's not really a valued quality at the moment. It can lead to you not being reelected. I mean, if you change your view on something, you will be told that you're flip-flopping and we can't trust what you say now because tomorrow you'll say something different. Whereas in the scientific community, if you say something now and you learn something, you would be thrown out of the community if you keep saying the same thing, because it means that you're not willing to change. And so we see these kinds of challenges presenting themselves, particularly in the UN space, in the governance space.
Perhaps let's circle into Fahid, and earlier on you were talking about open source technology, and open source is a collaborative approach. Many individuals are contributing to creating a common goal. But my thoughts to you, Fahid, is there also perhaps space and relevance in developing a just transition with proprietary software, where there's also an opportunity to somehow create collaboration with the community, which ultimately would be using that kind of software or technology?
I think proprietary software by its essence will always fail versus open source when the rate of change is slower inside and outside. The biggest example is my home. And when I was a kid, I used to have a library in my background, not so many back pictures. And it was a lot of blue books, Encyclopedia Universalis, remember? Encyclopedia Britannica. And every couple of years we had to buy again. Some Iranians have started to do Encyclopedia Iranica about Iran. Professor Yarshat there in Colombia, it took him 50 years. Wikipedia has 280,000 contributors. It's the 10th most read site globally. So I would say proprietary is great, but the power of the collective. And I would urge all of you in the call to actually go on Wikipedia and edit a page. It's an amazing experience. You actually feel that you're not just a user of technology, but contributor. So I think the ability of normal people to contribute is immense. And when you become not a passive person, but a contributor, it also changes your mindset. The other one is that I agree with you, this fundamental decision on AI and machine learning. It's fantastic to discuss, but do you even as an individual understand this? I would actually suggest, we're at Corona, we have COVID, we're at home, take a 10-hour course on machine learning. Nowadays, you can start program with APIs, with bots, with your Industry 4.0, with your home program. I would say it's our responsibility for all of us to understand this new vocabulary. Young, old, if you're at home, nowadays, unless you understand, unless you get yourself into this, it's difficult to have it as a theoretical level. And the barriers to entry are extremely low, right? Now it's very easy. You just take pieces of code, you can put them together, learn on YouTube. So I say yes, of course, it's proprietary code is great, but open source, all of you can become a contributor. And once you change from a passive recipient to an active contributor, and I know that this is what Townshend is encouraging, for everyone to be participating in society, creating, getting your voice as small as it may be.
Yeah, very good points. They're talking about participation. That's all the time we have for our panelist discussion. And now we're going to be handing it over to everybody in the audience. So I want to say thank you again, Daniel, Farid, Vahid, and Soraya, which has been this interesting debate around educating for values, the role of digital technology in a just transition. Now it's time for all of you to be part of the discussion. And thank you everyone who has submitted questions in the chat box. We'll try to get through as many questions we have so that you've submitted in the last 20 minutes for this particular webinar. I'll just invite Jordan, my IT tech support, to also re-spotlight our panelists for this particular discussion. I think there's a lot of questions that come through in the chat box, so I'm sure we're going to be circling in with all our panelists as well as Daniel in our last 15 minutes. Speaking about Daniel, Daniel Shavero has opened up with questions. Daniel, thank you so much for giving us your first question. And Daniel's asking you, Daniel, could you shed a little bit more light on the notion of just transition in the theme? What change or shift is envisioned here so that we can see how digital technologies fit in? Good question.
Yes, so this idea of just transition, Daniel, nice name, by the way. This question is one that came to us actually because of the title of the commission. They wanted a just transition. The idea being that we do need a transition from where we are with our overconsumption and very materialist frame to one that is more respective of the earth and of others. And that in that transition, there's going to be tremendous job losses and community shifts. And it's just part of the reality. And either that transition happens by our choice, and we can do it justly in a way where we support those communities that are perhaps most vulnerable or most at risk, or it will happen unjustly through increased natural disasters and other such things. And the question I think before humanity is how can we ensure that the transition from where we are to a more equitable and socially and environmentally conscious world happens in a way that's just. So how do we retrain workers out of industries that are perhaps not good in the long run? How do we ensure that as tax benefits and all of these things are shifted and transitioned, it doesn't actually do more harm than good? And I think actually there's a tremendous role for AI and digital tech in gaming out what these alternative futures could look like and how we can get from A to B. And so that kind of just transition is what we're trying to speak to, but we're doing it, I think, from a deeper level than merely retraining people to work in a different industry. It's got to be about how to maintain those community connections and encourage greater equity and equality in the world.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Daniel Shavara, for that question. Next question is from Justin Green. Thanks, Justin, for submitting your question. And Justin asks, what applications of digital technology are most effective at supporting positive values and bringing people together, as opposed to creating harmful impacts on human progress and relationships?
Are you asking me or Vahid, who clearly has much more expertise in this?
Well, I think perhaps you give an opportunity for Vahid, you circle to him. So Vahid, perhaps you can go ahead and provide your answer to Justin's question.
I was guilty of the same task as Daniel. Sorry, if you just summarize me the question 1 second.
Absolutely. Justin's asking what applications of digital technology are most effective at supporting positive values and bringing people together, as opposed to creating harmful impacts on human progress and relationships.
Honestly, I mean, my mind is Wikipedia. This is an amazing thing. You should read about the history of Wikipedia, how it came through, what it replaced. I mean, you remember at some point we were saying, oh no, don't check Wikipedia, it's banned in the schools. Now we don't even question it. So I think for me, the information, and if I remember, so I wanted to be a medical student, right? When you're an Iranian family, you can be doctor, lawyer, or engineer. So I went to Africa, I wanted to save the kids. I went to Congo on my year of service. And then I went and I saw in the hospital, they actually injected glucose in the hands of people. Why? Glucose is sugar. Because if you keep someone in the night in the hospital, you get paid. So the doctors had an incentive to actually lie to people. And I thought to myself, actually, what's missing is not medical doctor. Engineering in Congo has hugely, very well-trained doctors that go in France and in Europe. Actually, it's the information and basic ability to understand the market price of grain, of cassava, but also basic medical health. And that's where I think for me, the value of whatever spreads information and brings information has a huge power in rebalancing society. So that's not even technological thing, but it's whatever spreads information, news in a very transparent and open way.
Very interesting. Thank you, Vahid, and thank you, Daniel. Next question is from Shala, and Shala asks, could you give an explanation of how, I guess it's digital transformation, I think that's what Shala's referencing here, could negatively replace or affect the values of a community?
So I'll just give a very quick response, and it's mostly related to this issue of social technology, because I think that we see the social network can have some really negative effects. And if you haven't seen The Social Dilemma, I would very strongly recommend that you take a look at it, and we can actually see how it impacts particularly our youth. And I think, I learned recently that at Townsend at 8 p.m. there's no more use of digital technology, and I think there's a tremendous advantage to that. Because it allows that social connection to retain. And there's a reason for it. It's because we recognize that there is some negative impact on our ability to interact with each other when we are doing it purely through the screens, through these self-reinforcing memes and all of these things. We go down these rabbit holes. And again, I understand this is mostly the social side. On the technology side, we see a lot of solutions, so-called solutions, coming from highly developed countries, being exported to others who may not have the appropriate infrastructure, the appropriate returns, capacities that are just assumed. And I don't have a specific example on my mind at the moment. I can perhaps do a little bit more research into it. But I do know that there are times when a digital technology of some kind or a certain technology is introduced to a community and it's just irrelevant. It goes unused. And unused is actually sometimes the best alternative, because it can also create competition within a community. Oh, who gets this new thing from the West that's going to be the best thing, and then they compete for it. And it can actually undermine the fabric of longstanding social connections. And I don't mean to glorify all the parts of the world that are not digitally plugged in. I recognize that there are some shortcomings in those communities as well. And that's why we need to have this socially just transition. It's not just blindly adopting one thing, but it's also not ignoring it entirely. And it's that balance that we have to strike. But finding those examples, I know that there are many around the world that we could highlight. They're not coming to me at the moment.
But I think you're bringing up a good point about we look at technology from one point of view, but Mitko references specifically about providing broadband and mobile devices are only part of the solution. He works for a non-profit dedicated to bridging the digital divide in the USA. And in many ways, with my own experience in Africa, when we have a lack of high quality mobile broadband connectivity or fixed broadband, or perhaps broadband that's available, but perhaps way too expensive for the average person, are we able to reach the end goal of providing all this technology that we speak of? I see that Vahid is nodding his head, and Farid. So perhaps let's start with Farid, and then we'll circle around to Vahid and also hear Daniel's comment to wrap that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's always important to look at the issue in a holistic way, and something that we've been doing in our company for the past 6 years now, where we created a nonprofit that helps disadvantaged youth to learn programming. And one of the main things is in the very, very beginning, we looked at what kind of curriculum can we use, or what kind of this and that. And eventually we came to the point, it's not really one thing that you need to do. It's about creating a learning environment. And if you have that environment, everyone can, because of technology today, everyone can create their own kind of small little learning environments. And I think that's a great opportunity that we are in right now, that because of technology, because of AI, because of all these amazing things that we have today, we are able to create these holistic learning environments where it's not just one thing that matters. It's a combination. It's a kind of small little networks that we need to create to advance.
In the interest of time, we only have about 6 minutes left, everybody. We have quite a few questions. So we're going to try and get to as many questions as possible. Bernie has given us a comment and a question saying, thank you, Daniel, for a wonderful presentation. I had the opportunity to share the BIC paper with our junior youth group, around 13 to 15-year-olds. And interestingly, through discussion, they were concerned about AI and how to ensure it will be used morally and equally throughout the world. How would you say this could be addressed as more work happens in this area around the world?
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, one of those questions where I think consultation is the answer. I mean, if we had the perfect policy, the perfect programmatic approach, then we would be doing it. But what we're finding, at least this is what I'm understanding, is that it's actually the process of research, investigation, testing. That process is what can be exported, so to speak, rather than the actual substance. So when it comes to artificial intelligence, we need to really have people looking at it critically and questioning it and understanding the impacts of one path versus another path for different communities. And as we have these conversations, we can start to better understand what's going on. And I'll just give an example that I think is really helpful from The Social Dilemma that for me was actually a key moment, where the protagonist in that film was saying, we have to be exploring this, understanding this, questioning this. And there was a rather old gentleman who just responded by saying, but humanity has always overcome these new barriers. I mean, humanity has always grown and managed to find ways to innovate out of it. But to me, the reason you can innovate out of it is because people are super concerned, like that first individual. And if you don't have people who are anxiously concerned, who are questioning, who are asking, then how do you expect humanity to overcome? And it's sort of that complacency that I think we are trying to fight against here and say, we can't just wait for someone else to figure out how AI won't have negative implications. We all have to figure out, as Vahid was saying as well, we all have to get engaged in this process because it is so important. So I don't think anybody has the answer right now, but there are these processes of learning that can be applied to these different spaces, and those are what we need, because without them, we're all just sort of rudderless in a sea of questions.
Sarai, any thoughts to what Daniel's just said?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that there's a lot of questioning that has to come about, and I think it's in relation to everything, not just AI. I'm not an AI specialist, but I have the same feelings that Dan has, and I think that we're really relying on those individuals that are innovating and really questioning technologies as they come out, and I think the more that we become conscious of the impacts of different technologies and the impacts that maybe those that build certain technologies have when they're not, based on diverse teams, or when they're not thinking about the individuals that they're impacting, the more change that there will be. But I don't have anything further to add.
Thanks, Soraya. We have one final question before we wrap up today's webinar. It comes from Mitko to Daniel and saying, how can we address the fact that from a relatively prosperous period of global integration, we seem to have entered a multipolar world where there are different schools of thought in the relation between technology and government's role, which often sidetracks the end users? Hopefully we can get you to ask that question in the next 90 seconds.
Yeah, that was actually, thank you so much, Mitko. That was actually my favorite question, because I think it speaks to that heart of the onion and sort of the conceptual framework that we have and the narratives that we tell ourselves around how the world works. It's based on an idea of the nation state and of identities of one kind or another. And it's all competition based. So my way, your way, which way is best, let's have them compete. And we'll figure out which one thing is the global thing that we should all be adopting. When in fact, we're learning that cooperation, I mean, as we've seen in the development of vaccines and all of this, cooperation is far more helpful to the advancing humanity than is competition. And so we do have, of course, a prosperity that comes from all this competition. Ford and GMC and all of these, they were really advancing. They were at the cutting edge. But there comes to a point where competition no longer serves the needs of all humanity. It starts to serve those only who are in these competitive spaces, and cooperation actually will have a greater impact. So we have to change the underlying assumptions that have gotten us to this point. And it's, again, not to denounce the tremendous progress that has been made, but it's to recognize that there comes a point when we have to think in terms of systems rather than competition only. And once we do that, we can learn, okay, there are different degrees of technology and government relationships. China does it one way, Europe does it another way, the United States does it another way. And there are different theories, there are benefits and drawbacks to each. No one is correct. And if we continue to be myopic and say, this is the way, and I can't learn from others, that's when we get into trouble. But that's how the world has been structured. It's how our educational systems have been structured. If you're wrong, even if you're wrong, you have to defend your position as hard as you can. It's how our justice system is structured. Develop a narrative, even if it's not true, that will get you acquitted. It's how our political system is structured. It's all based on competition. And you see how lies begin to advance a certain narrative in this competitive framing. And we have to start to unravel this. And you can't unravel it in a world of identity crisis and competition. You have to do it in a world of global citizenship, shared prosperity, and a learning posture, which is, it's very hard to do. It's actually, because of how we've been culturally trained, it's a little bit backwards to what we think is progress. And the we I'm speaking of is mostly, Western American types. It's not backwards to everybody in the world. There are many cultures that are based on cooperation and mutual benefit. And we have a lot to learn from those cultures, even in the area of digital technology, where they may not have quite as much experience. So it's a big question, but I think it comes back to those foundational values of how we understand progress, development, and flourishing.
Great way to wrap things up today. I want to say thank you so much, Daniel Perell, Farid Bidardel, Vad Kamzi, and Soraya Bagheri, who joined us today, as well as you who watched and participated in this webinar. In case you missed anything we covered, this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the Townsend website. Now, next time, we'll be joined by Omar Tabangar, who will be talking about global citizenship as the ultimate 21st century skill. Please make sure you register on the website info.townshend.cz/talks. Also a reminder to please visit Townshend30.com for more information to give it, make a gift or a loan towards the purchase of the Townsend International School campus. Thanks again for being with us here, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.